Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much for coming along today to the Faculty of Law at the Chinese University of Hong Kong for our Greater China Legal History seminar series. This is our 5th anniversary year, so this is our 5th year of these seminars, and we're very pleased today, very honoured to have with us Professor Norman Ho. Norman opened our series of seminars last year with a brilliant seminar on Confucianism in Chinese law, and today he's got, well, maybe an even more interesting topic to talk to you about. Today Norman is going to be talking to us about mutilating corporal punishments and theories of punishment in traditional Chinese legal thought. So please join me in welcoming Professor Norman Ho. Thank you.
Today I'm going to talk about a rather perhaps sordid topic that if you're squeamish, it may not be terribly welcoming, but today I'm going to talk about mutilating corporal punishments, or known in Chinese Mandarin as rouxing, and theories of punishment in traditional Chinese legal thought. So this is just a quick outline of what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to just provide a little bit of background to what mutilating corporal punishments were in Chinese legal history, and because it takes too much time to say mutilating corporal punishments all the time, I'm just going to abbreviate it as MCP. Okay, so MCP refers to mutilating corporal punishment. So I'll start off with some background on it. And then one of the interesting things that we'll see is, as I'll talk about later, mutilating corporal punishments were used in Chinese antiquity, but they were later abolished by an emperor in the Han Dynasty. I'll go over that more later. But after their abolishing, there were actually many debates throughout Chinese history over the course of almost 1,000 years or so, with people arguing, should we reinstate MCPs? And other people saying, no, we should keep them abolished. And so we'll take a look at these debates and look at what they reveal about justificatory theories of punishment in traditional China. I mean, if we think about just generally, I'm sure people learned this in criminal law or legal theory class. If you think about what the main theories of punishment or the justifications of punishment we have today, right? The oldest justification for legal punishment is retribution theory, right? It's also been described as the most natural justification, right? Retribution theory basically says we should punish because it is what the offender deserves, right? So it's backward looking. It's a theory of moral desert, right? And then, of course, there are consequentialist theories justifying punishment. For example, that punishment is good due to the consequences it brings in society, such as deterring future criminals, incapacitating criminals, right? So they can't offend again. And also rehabilitation, punishment as rehabilitation to make criminals see their wrong and be better. And so we'll take a look at what the debates over MCPs tell us about how traditional Chinese thought about punishment. Okay? And as I hope to show you today, the substance of the debates and the positions didn't really change at all, right? From, say, the Han Dynasty all the way to the Song Dynasty. So there's a remarkable continuity in how Chinese legal thinkers and officials thought about the place of punishment. And then I'll reach some general conclusions at the end. So just fair warning, we're getting to the squeamish slide. So for those of you that are squeamish, you may wish to turn away. So just to begin with some background to the MCPs. Okay? In traditional China, there are in Chinese antiquity, there was something known as the 5 punishments, or wuxing, okay? And I've listed them out here along with the Chinese characters. So the first was tattooing, and tattooing was something quite unpleasant. Basically, you would be held down, and a knife would be carving into your skin, right? And then afterwards, they would throw black ink into the wound, and basically, it's a forced tattooing. So this is a photo from, on the left side, from a Chinese TV drama, and you can see this guy is going through the punishment of tattooing, okay? And then, so the top slide shows you what it was like, and then the bottom slide shows you the result, right? Amputation of the nose was another one of the ancient 5 punishments, right? And you can see here, this is a picture showing you how it was performed in Chinese antiquity, the kind of knife that was being used, and the nose was removed with a slice up. Okay? This is just a photo at the bottom from a Chinese TV drama. This is an official who had suffered amputation from the nose, and as you can see, to hide that, they had these special sort of, I guess you would call them nose necklaces or nose braces made, so they could hide the stigma of having the nose being cut. But of course, anyone who sees their face would realize that their nose had been cut. I just put this picture here because the amputation of nose is still used as punishment in some societies today. This woman appeared on Time magazine, Bibi Aisha, 18 years old, I believe, because she had tried to escape her abusive in-laws. The Taliban caught up with her and, as punishment, performed forced rhinotomy. I think the surgical term that doctors use for removing the nose is called rhinotomy. So unfortunately, she suffered forced rhinotomy there. And then another one of the ancient 5 punishments was amputation of the left foot, right foot, or if you were particularly unlucky, both. Okay? And this is just a traditional Chinese drawing or engraving showing the amputation of the foot. Castration. Of course, I did not want to show too detailed a photo for that. People can use their imaginations. But this is also just a photo from a Chinese TV drama showing how castration is being set up, right? And I'm not going to show photos of the actual process, but and castration refers to the removal of the, at least male castration, referring to the removal of the male testes or gonads, okay? And then the death sentence, so capital punishment. When the Chinese thinkers we'll study today are looking at MCPs, they're referring primarily to the first 4 of these 5 punishments. So tattooing, amputation of the nose, amputation of the left foot, right foot, or both, and castration. Okay, so this is just what the punishments are. In terms of their origins, where they're from, where these mutilating corporal punishments are from, the traditional account is that they come from a ethnic minority group, right, the Miao peoples, right? So not the Han peoples, the Miao peoples, which is interesting because it's sort of back then, right, I don't think the Han Chinese wanted anyone to think that they were responsible for such cruel punishment. So they blamed the Miao people, okay? But this is just a passage from a Confucian classical text called the Book of Documents, right, which tells us about the origins, the supposed origins of the MCPs. Among the people of the Miao, they did not use the power of goodness, but the restraint of punishments. They made the 5 punishments engines of oppression, calling them the laws. They slaughtered the innocent and were the first also to go to excess in cutting off the nose, cutting off the ears, castration, and branding. MCPs were used, we have evidence to show that they were used in the Song Dynasty, Zhou Dynasty, and the Qin Dynasty. There were other punishments that were used as well during that period, namely penal servitude and hard labor. Penal servitude, by the way, is not the same as what we think of as imprisonment. Penal servitude, basically, you're locked in the penal colony and doing forced work for the state. It could be building a road, building some structures, and so forth. Okay. And just some historical background, which will form the basis of the presentation today. As I mentioned, MCPs were later abolished in the Han Dynasty by Emperor Wen, Han Wendi, who was known in Chinese history as being a sort of very good and kind and compassionate emperor. So he is credited with abolishing the MCPs and replacing them with other punishments. So if you're interested with the specifics, right, tattooing he replaces with other punishments such as shaving with the head, wearing iron collar around the neck, or forced labor. Shaving, I think most of us would prefer having our head shaved, our hair shaved, rather than tattooing. So that's probably an improvement. I don't know about the forced labor part. Amputation of the nose was replaced with 300 blows with the light stick. And generally speaking, where were you hit? You were generally hit with the light stick on the buttocks area. Okay. The light stick, in case anybody wants to know the specifics, we know in the Han Dynasty the sticks are made out of bamboo. However, that is later changed in the Tang Dynasty to wood, okay, which I guess would be more painful than bamboo. In case you're really interested in more specifics, we don't know for sure the size and length of the stick being used in the Han. But just as a reference point, in the Tang Dynasty, the stick was around 102 centimeters, so that's about 40 inches for those of you who use the imperial system. The width of the light stick was approximately 0.2 inches at one end, so that's about 0.5 centimeters, and 0.15 inches on the other hand, which is about 0.38 centimeters. Okay. Amputation of the left foot was replaced with 500 blows of the light stick, and amputation of the right foot actually was replaced with the death penalty. So as you'll see, the Emperor Wen's reforms do get some controversy later on, because some Chinese thinkers argued, well, even though he abolished the mutilating corporal punishments, the replacements are not necessarily more humane. So, what would you prefer, having your right foot cut off or being killed? I think most people in the room would prefer being alive but wobbling on one foot. Also, there were reports in the Han Dynasty of people, for example, getting blows with the light stick. There were reports of people dying after being beaten, right? And so, was Emperor Wen's reform, did it make that big of a difference? That it created quite a bit of controversy later on. Emperor Qin of the Han Dynasty, Han Jingdi, he also further reduces the number of beatings and sets forth more detailed regulations on beatings. This is because, as I said, during Emperor Wen's period, many people died from the beatings. And so Emperor Qin, which is also regarded as a compassionate emperor in Chinese history, reduces the number of beatings. In the later periods, the Wei-Jin Nanbeicao, Wei-Jin Northern and Southern Dynasty periods, of course, MCPs had been abolished, so the punishments that were being used included the death penalty, shaving the head, redemption, and fines. Redemption and fines, what's the difference between that? Fines is just, well, if you commit a crime, you have to pay a fine, right? Redemption was when you were facing some more serious punishment, for example, shaving the head, I suppose. And if you were rich and you were of a certain social class, you could pay the government a certain amount of money and not suffer that punishment that you didn't want to. Right? So, but redemption was also seen as a sort of punishment, but it's a bit different than a fine. Later in the Sui and Tang dynasties, the 5 punishments were standardized as beating with the light stick, beating with the heavy stick, penal servitude, exile, and the death penalty. Right? And under the Tang Code, the death penalty was essentially either strangulation or, I believe, decapitation. Okay? And so this becomes the standard 5 punishments in Chinese criminal law from the Sui, Tang, and on. Okay? And as I mentioned at the beginning, after Emperor Wen abolished MCPs in 167 BC, there were continued calls throughout Chinese history for their reinstatement, but that never happened. So we're going to look at some of the debates and positions of people, right, in the MCP debate. The last thing, just by way of background, is why were MCPs considered very significant, and what was their impact in society? Well, I think there are 2 major types of impact in Chinese society. One is the physical impact of MCPs. I think this is pretty self-explanatory, right? For the government, MCPs were a very powerful, right, tool because they were a literal physical sign of the state's power to impose punishment on you, visible to everybody, right? If you had a tattoo on your face, you walk outside, everyone sees the state's power literally inscribed on you. Your foot is cut off, your nose is cut off, right? A powerful physical deterrent effect in society. But there's another impact of MCPs that's equally, if not more important, that many people seem to downplay, is the spiritual impact of MCPs, especially after Confucianism was declared the official state philosophy, right, in the Han Dynasty. And MCPs, under traditional Confucian ideas of filial piety, it was believed that you received your skin, your body from your parents. And you had a duty to your parents and also your ancestors to take care of your physical body. Right? So self-mutilation or being mutilated by others would be also a form of unfilial behavior on your part. How could you let your body be damaged that way? Right? And so when you die, what happens is you die in a state of almost unfilial piety, right? Sort of you're shaming your parents. This is an excerpt from the Xiao Jing, the Classic of Filial Piety, which is a Chinese Confucian text teaching people how to be filial. I just want to quickly take a look at this, right? The master said, master here is referring to Confucius. Filial piety is the root of all virtue and the stem out of which grows all moral teaching. Sit down again and I'll explain the subject to you. He's talking to his student, Zhenzi. Our bodies, to every hair and bit of skin, are received by us from our parents, and we must not presume to injure or wound them. This is the beginning of filial piety. So think about it. If you've suffered an MCP, your journey to being a great filial son or daughter, it's already been sort of stamped out or intruded on right at the beginning, right? Because you've let your body become defaced. Okay? Interestingly, this idea, our bodies, hair, and skin are from our parents. I don't know if some of you may watch Chinese TV dramas, but there's a line often that parents say to describe their children in Chinese. In Mandarin, oftentimes parents say things like, "Oh, my child, 他是我身上掉下来的一块肉," right? Literally, in English, it would be, "Oh, my child, he's literally a piece of meat, a flesh that fell from my body," right? That sort of symbolizes this kind of idea, right, or this prevailing cultural belief that continues. Okay. Now we're going to proceed to looking at some of the debates on the reinstatement of MCPs and looking at what they can tell us about Chinese theories of punishment. Okay. This is just a table I've created just to show you the main debates that we'll be covering. Due to time limitations, we probably won't be able to cover all of these, but I've chosen the key debates. Okay, and as you can see, we're starting in 167 BC, which is when Emperor Wen of the Han Dynasty abolishes MCPs. And we proceed Han Dynasty, Qin Dynasty, 4th century, and we'll conclude with the Song Dynasty in the 12th century AD. Okay. I guess just one fair warning. In my slides, I'm going to break a very important rule of making PowerPoint. And that is, everybody knows when you make PowerPoint slides, what's one important rule? Never put too much text on a slide, right? I'm going to break that rule, but I think I have a good reason. Because rather than summarize these Chinese officials and thinkers, I want you guys to see the actual original sources and what they said. And I think that allows us to get closer to these people who were living thousands of years ago. But anyway, I just want to begin with Emperor Wen's declaration, right, where he abolishes MCPs. If we take a look at what he says, right, if the people nowadays commit transgressions while teaching is not extended to them, the punishments already applied to them. Maybe they desire to change their actions to become good, but to the road thereto there is no means of access. We greatly pity this. When the mutilating punishments are applied, members are cut off and the skin is carved, so that to the end of one's life they will not grow again. How painful are these punishments, and how unvirtuous am I? How could this ever correspond to the idea of being the father and the mother of the people? Let the mutilating punishments be abolished, and let there be something to replace them. So if we look at the kind of arguments that Emperor Wen is making against MCPs, right, he makes a couple, I think. One, he is concerned about his own reputation, right? He wants to be seen as a loving emperor of the people. Hence he says, how could this correspond to the idea of being the father and mother of the people, right? How unvirtuous am I, right? He also talks about, well, I guess to use the modern American criminal law terminology, the cruel and unusual punishment that is MCPs. He talks about how cruel they are. Your members, right, your parts of your body are being cut off, right, and they won't grow back. He's concerned, but he's also concerned about the finality of MCPs and how they might, how they might not how they'll reduce hope from people, right? And they won't give people, criminals, the hope, right, to get better again, right? Because again, mutilating corporal punishments are final. Okay? So he's clearly against MCPs. Now, later on, a very prominent Chinese scholar named Ban Gu sets forth his views on this debate. Ban Gu is famous in Chinese history because he's the author of the Han Shu, or the Book of the Han, the official dynastic history of the Han Dynasty. Let's take a look at what he said. Okay. Now he's pro-MCP. Okay, pro-MCP. Moreover, the abolition of the mutilating punishments is fundamentally the desire to keep people intact thereby. Now, moving away 1 degree from shaving the head and wearing an iron collar, one enters unexpectedly into the category of the supreme penalty, but catching people by means of the death penalty is missing the original intention of preserving them. That therefore those who are made to die are to be counted by tens of thousands annually is brought about by the severity of punishments. On the other hand, if we turn to evils like theft by breaking and coming in or wounding people in a fit of anger, or men and women abandoning themselves to lechery, or officials committing villainous graft, the punishment of shaving the head and wearing an iron collar is far from sufficient to repress them. Therefore, those who are punished are to be counted annually by hundreds of thousands. So, what are Ban Gu's arguments in favor of the MCPs? Right? Basically, you can summarize it this way. This first paragraph, as you can see, he is concerned with over-punishment. In other words, his point is, when Emperor Wen abolished MCPs, that led to something in society where some people are being over-punished. So do you guys remember one of Emperor Wen's reforms was, instead of, rather than getting your right foot cut off, you'll be killed, you'll be executed, right? And so Ban Gu says, that creates situations where we're over-punishing people. And the other problem with abolishing MCPs is it leads to a situation where we're under-punishing people, right? Because these are serious crimes like theft and hitting people, committing assault, and just shaving your hair off and wearing an iron collar for a period of time. That doesn't have enough deterrent effect, right? That does not have deterrent effect, right? It's far from sufficient to repress them, right? So he clearly sees MCPs as being effective for their deterrence. The next major recorded position we have in this debate is in 208 AD, the Han Dynasty official Kong Rong, okay? And he provides an anti-MCP view, okay? So again, I'm just going to show the original source in both Chinese and English. And if we just take a look at what he says, right, and then think about what he says, right? Kong Rong argues, in antiquity, society was simple and pure, and good and evil were clearly distinguished. Officials were upright, laws and punishments were clear, affairs of state were simple, and governance was carried out without error. Thus, when the people committed crimes, they were willingly submitted to punishment. But in later dynasties, the political situation declined. The atmosphere became corrupt, decrees undermined the people's customs, and laws harmed education. Therefore, the Analect said, the rulers have failed in their duties, and the people consequently have become disorganized for a long time. Now you desire to use MCPs to restrain the people, to use brutal punishments of cutting off limbs to abuse them. This does not accord with the common natural principle of developing and changing in accordance with the needs of changing times. Kong Rong makes an argument against MCPs, and we'll see this repeated throughout the debate over Chinese history. His key point here is what? The times have changed, right? When times change, the laws and punishments should change also, right? This is a very basic principle in, I guess, almost any legal culture or jurisdiction. He argues times have changed now, right, in the Han, and it's not appropriate to bring back MCPs. Why? Specifically, what is he arguing here? When we had MCPs back in the old days, officials were upright, the emperors were all righteous people, and people who were able, therefore, to understand MCPs better, right? And they were applied fairly. But now, people are corrupt, officials are corrupt, and the atmosphere is not suitable anymore. So if you apply MCPs to the present day, the effects will be completely different. People won't be able to appreciate them as much or understand them like they did before in Chinese antiquity, right? And Kong Rong continues his views, right? Furthermore, those who suffer MCPs will not have the will in their hearts to live. Once they are aware of this lack of will to live, many of them will engage in evil, and none will be willing to turn away from their evil ways and return to what is good. Right? Su Sha rebelled in the state of Qi. Yilei, sorry, that's a typo. Yilei brought disaster in the state of Song. Zhao Gao in the Qin, and Yingbu in the Han all caused great disasters in society. Thus, it can be seen that MCPs are unable to stop people from committing crimes. Right? So Kong Rong also advances an argument saying, first of all, MCPs should not be brought back because they don't have deterrence effect, right? And actually, they lead to the opposite results we want, right? He says, why? Because if you apply an MCP, you basically cut off all of that person's hope. He'll lose all hope, he'll be in despair, and he'll just commit more crimes, right? And by the way, these people he lists out here, he's using history to prove his argument. These are basically all people in Chinese history, before Kong Rong's time, of course, who had suffered some sort of mutilating punishment and basically committed even more crimes later in their life. So he's saying, well, look at history, right? We should learn from history as well. Now we're going to proceed to the Qin Dynasty and look at a pro-MCP argument from Liu Song. And Liu Song, I think he's very interesting, so we'll spend a bit more time on him because he advances a very complete and probably the most sophisticated view in favor of reinstating MCPs. Okay? He was also a very important figure in his time in the Qin. He was, I think the English translation of his title would be Chamberlain of Law Enforcement. And essentially, he was an important judicial official, and part of his job was hearing and giving advice on particularly difficult cases, especially difficult criminal cases that lower magistrates could not handle, and he would provide his advice. Okay? So let's take a look at his arguments in favor of reinstating MCPs. I've broken it up across several slides, so the text is easier to read. Okay? So he begins, these days, capital punishment is excessive, and so many people have lost their lives. At the same time, other punishments are overly lax, and so even sentencing and punishing offenders cannot stop evil breaking of laws. All of this phenomenon is due to the non-use of MCPs. So you see, this is essentially repeating Bangu's argument. Bangu and the Han, remember, had argued in favor of MCP reinstatement. Liu Song basically continues the argument. He says that, well, the problem now that we've gotten rid of MCPs is some people are being overpunished. They're being put to death when what they really deserve is just a MCP. And of course, some people are being punished too lightly, right? And this is leading to terrible consequences and situation in society. Okay. So again, this slide again breaks the rule of don't put too much text on the slide, but I hope you guys will bear with me because I want to show the original source. Okay. And in this passage, this is a very interesting passage, which I provide here in translation. Liu Song sets out the heart of his argument. Okay? The sage kings had profound reasons for establishing MCPs. Such reasons and matters can be known and explained. Okay, well, that's good to know, right? Okay. The rationale for MCPs is not just that the evil and lawless will stop their evil conduct because they fear the pain of losing one of their limbs, right? So he's saying, MCPs, yeah, we support MCPs because they have a deterrence effect, right? But that's not the only reason. MCPs remove their tools for criminal and evil acts. Those who are evil and treacherous will, because of MCPs, be unable to do whatever they want. Evil and treachery are stopped at the root. This is indeed the wisest rationale and reason. Amputate the feet of those who prison break, and they are unable to escape in the future. Amputate the pairs of hands of those who steal, and it is impossible for them to steal again. Amputating the reproductive organs of those who commit illicit sexual crimes follows the same logic. There is no better way to get rid of evil and close the door to catastrophes. Taking such an approach is not futile. This is what we would call what in modern punishment theory vocabulary? This is an incapacitation argument, right? It's a consequentialist argument. It's an incapacitation one. Liu Song's basically saying MCPs are good because they're a form of incapacitation, right? Cut off the human part of the human body which leads them to commit crimes. Interestingly, I did some, just before this seminar, I did some research to see if any mutilating corporal punishments were still being applied actually in societies today. And I was surprised to learn actually in Europe, in the Czech Republic, chemical castration, and so not physical castration, but chemical castration is still used to deal with certain sex offenders. And I think the way the law there works is it's voluntary. So a sex offender can choose to get chemical castration. Chemical castration, by the way, for those of you who are not familiar with it, and again, it's not a very pleasant subject, but basically a man, for example, a man is injected with various, basically things that change his hormones, right? And reduce the level of testosterone in a man, so hence his sex drive is reduced and he can't go out and commit sex crimes anymore. And so it's voluntary in the Czech Republic, but then I read a source that said it's still criticized by many human rights activists because even though technically it's voluntary, oftentimes the offender is presented with a choice. You can either get chemical castration and you'll be released, or life imprisonment, right? Or long imprisonment. And so many offenders actually, they find the chemical castration to be much more attractive, right? Rather than being locked up in prison. So clearly the Czech government sees chemical castration as sort of almost an incapacitation type punishment, right? Okay. So if we go back to here, let's see, where did we stop? Okay, here. After the criminals have been punished with MCPs, they will each go home. They will each go home, and their parents, wives, and children will look after them and take care of them. They will no longer be wandering about destitute. There will, of course, be difficulties at first, but once their wounds have healed, they can still perform labor. This is in accordance with the system in antiquity. They can also be assigned different work to do in accordance with the current times and situation. Even though they have become handicapped, they have not been abandoned. Rather, what they have worried about, which is doing bad and committing harm, have been eliminated. And furthermore, the important principle of human relations, of giving birth to sons and daughters, reproducing and growing, have not been harmed. Okay? So interestingly here, we see Liu Song, he justified MCPs on the deterrence ground. He justified it on a incapacitation ground. And now this is kind of more of a rehabilitative ground, right? Still consequentialist, but more rehabilitative, right? The idea that the MCPs, once they're applied to somebody, you know, he'll think hard about it. It'll be hard for him at first, but then he'll go back home to his loving family who will help him become a productive member again of society. Of course, Liu Song, if you wanted to give the counter-argument, right, this assumes a lot, right? Number one, this assumes that the criminal has a family to go back to, right, number one. Number two, it assumes that even if he has a family to go back to, they'll accept him, right? Remember, there's this huge stigma, right, with MCPs. I guess it assumes also there's an active labor market, right, that can absorb this criminal. But this is Liu Song's arguments, right? And of course, one has to ask, right, what if both feet are cut off, right? Could he really work, right? But the important thing is that that's another argument that Liu Song makes in favor of MCPs. And you guys probably noticed the other justification he uses for MCPs is what? He repeats often, right? Look at the first sentence. The sage kings had profound reasons for establishing MCPs, right? And if you look here, this is in accordance with the system in antiquity, right? So he's also using history, Chinese antiquity, as a justification. In other words, we should have MCPs because that's the way the sage kings did it, right? Okay, so clearly he sees MCPs in a much more favorable, comforting light. Okay, and then he continues, right, and presents some more arguments. At present, we should reduce the scope of capital punishment rather than use capital punishment for the crimes of jailbreaking multiple times, rape, and stealing. Mutilating corporal punishment should replace the use of capital punishments. And after receiving the punishments, additional punishment should not be imposed, and those who were sentenced to penal servitude should not have their sentences increased. Those limbs that were lost and destroyed will, for the offender's entire life, serve as a warning and lesson. When people see the pain of those offenders who received MCPs, feelings of fear will arise and they will not dare to commit crimes. This situation is definitely many times better than the current situation. And those who committed evil received their due and deserved punishments after their crimes were exposed and the methods and tools they used to commit crimes have been cut off. This will transform those who have received punishments into good citizens. This last paragraph is interesting, right, because he sort of summarizes all of his arguments, right? MCPs are good because they deter, they incapacitate. Interestingly, he makes a retribution argument as well, right? Those who committed evil received their due and deserved punishments, right? So he must have been thinking, for example, if you rape somebody, what do you deserve? Well, you deserve castration, right? It's a very retributive type logic, and also rehabilitation, right? This will transform those who have received punishments into good citizens. Okay. Liu Song makes another interesting argument, though. It's still a consequentialist argument. He also says MCPs basically will help reduce certain administrative inefficiencies in government, which is very fascinating. So he says, if we use MCPs now, not only will penal colonies not be overcrowded, the evil crimes of criminals will also naturally stop because they will lack the physical tools they need to commit those crimes. Okay? If we deal with these problems by removing the two causes, then the number of cases will not be that high, and therefore amnesties will not have to be repeatedly given. This is of great benefit to perfecting and unifying the kingdom's laws and regulations. Right? So every legal jurisdiction, doesn't matter whether you're Chinese culture, Russian culture, American culture, right? What's one thing the government always has a problem with? Backlog of cases, huge number of cases, right? Maybe overcrowding in prisons, right? Judges, legal officials, overworked, right? Liu Song himself, remember I mentioned he's a high-ranking judicial official, chamberlain of law enforcement. He's fully attuned to these kind of administrative challenges. So here he's making an interesting consequentialist argument, right? MCPs are good because it'll reduce our work burden, right? It'll reduce our work burden. Okay. Okay, now we're going to get into the 31880 debate in the Qin Dynasty. And this one's very interesting because we have a historical record of various positions in one central debate, right, at one point in time. And I'm going to go through most of these thinkers. And to be honest, when you see their positions and their articulated arguments, you'll see they're really not much different than the positions that have been articulated before, right, which goes to my point that there's continuity, right, in how Chinese legal officials throughout time thought about MCP. So let's just go through this debate, okay? And I'll show you some of the passages so you can see them. This is an official named Wei-Jin, okay? In 318, there's this debate at court, and he's more pro-MCP, right? So you guys can see what he says. In ancient times, mutilating corporal punishments were used. It was applied by the sage rulers of antiquity. Again, he sort of seems to be suggesting, just as Liu Song did, the sage king used them, why shouldn't we? Emperor Wen of the Han Dynasty abolished them, but the number of crimes punishable by death actually increased. Well, we've heard that argument before, right? Over-punishment of because MCPs are gone. Today, our population is low and is not even 1% of what it was. That may be... he may be exaggerating slightly there, okay? If our criminal law and punishments are harsh and severe, this is not in accordance with the reproductive spirit that King Goujian of Yue previously encouraged. Sorry, typo. I believe that we should reinstate mutilating corporal punishments to make the civilization of our peaceful society even brighter. I think Wei Zhan's argument is pretty interesting because, again, he's concerned with over-punishing. Too many people are being put to death, but he also explicitly says what? He presents another consequentialist argument in favor of MCPs. He says, if we bring back MCPs, our population will go up. And that's good for our state. He is supported by officials at court like Wang Dao, okay? And Wang Dao's sort of, if you want to call it a clique, right, or group. And they basically say what? Now, for all those thieves who steal others' property, for those electors who covet women, for those convicts who have escaped from their corvée obligations, their crimes all do not involve murder, and so MCPs should be imposed on them. applying mutilating corporal punishment can stop their crime. So making a deterrence argument here, but also a retribution argument as well, right? These crimes, stealing, hiding from labor, right? They shouldn't be punished more severely. MCPs are what they deserve. Applying mutilating corporal punishment stop their crimes. Right? If we use capital punishment by decapacitation, that punishment exceeds the seriousness of their crimes. Once someone has died, he cannot be brought back to life. So again, very similar arguments, for example, to what Bangu was saying and Liu Song, right? The concern over punishing. This is another passage from Wang Dao, okay? And essentially, he advances a deterrence argument here, which again, we've seen already before, nothing new. Those who have been seduced by anti-MCP talk argue that even capital punishment cannot stop evil, and so therefore, what could mutilating corporal punishments do? But ordinary people are stupid. In other words, they are stubbornly thick-headed, and their stupidity reaches immense heights. So even that's very strong hierarchical views, right? So even if you execute them under severe capital punishment, their bodies will quickly turn to dust. As the days pass after the execution, the evil desires of the living still persevere daily. They will not, because of capital punishment, change or repent. If the court uses MCPs in the streets to publicly punish criminals, it will cause people to all day and all night remember it as a lesson. Those who have been punished will sigh and lament the everlasting pain brought by their committing crimes. Those who do evil will personally see the permanent wounds caused by the amputation of limbs, and they will feel extremely afraid. Now, having gone through all of the above, we can understand that the ancient kings, in applying less severe punishments than capital punishment, was to manage the people and give them warnings to control their stupidity. The principles within this are indeed very profound and deep. Right? So, nothing fundamentally new here in terms of arguments. Wang Dao and his group advance a deterrence argument. They give a bit more specifics also. I think what's interesting here is they explain a bit more why capital punishment is not an effective deterrence method. I remember when I was first researching and reading this passage, I remember thinking this is quite interesting, right? There's a huge debate nowadays over capital punishment, whether to retain it or to abolish it, right? And the people who argue in favor of abolishing capital punishment, right? Sometimes they question whether it really has a deterrence effect, right? I was just thinking, Wang Dao, his argument might be very attractive even today, but of course that assumes if the country wants to bring back MCPs, right? Which I don't think most people would. But he's saying capital punishment is not an effective deterrence. People will be executed, and most people will forget about them, right? But MCPs, it's a constant living daily reminder, both for the criminal and for you and me, right? Seeing them walk in the streets with the nose cut off, and we'll be afraid every day, right? And you can see, again, he grounds his argument in the authority of who, again? The ancient kings, the ancient kings. And you can see that he refers to MCPs essentially as an educational tool, right? As an educational tool to teach, in his view, the stupid common people, okay? Now, they are met in this debate with Zhou Yi and his various followers, right, who are staunchly anti-MCP, okay? And, okay, we'll just start. I probably won't read the whole thing, but just start at the beginning here. However, we believe that the severity or leniency of punishment should be decided in accordance with the needs of and at the time of the particular situation. If at one time there was not much crime committed from the people and they easily succumbed to great authority, punishments can be lenient and applied mercifully. But if at one time the people commit many crimes and are not easily controlled by authority, then it would be appropriate to use capital punishment as a means to stop crime, right? Mutilating corporal punishments should be used as punishments during times of peace and order. They should not, right? They should not be used to save times of corruption, right? Currently, we have just begun the process of educating and civilizing the populace. There is much evil thoughts and desires among the people, and among them, people who are accustomed to committing crimes continue to bad things. Using death penalty has not been able to stop them, so how could changing the punishments to amputation of legs or nose have any effect? Reducing the severity of punishments leads criminals to commit lesser crimes and to be punished mercifully, and then the number of criminals will increase in number. So Zhou Yi, what is he saying here? Again, he begins with an argument that's very similar to the anti-MCP argument we heard earlier with Kong Rong, which is that times have changed and we shouldn't use MCPs, right? And he basically argues nowadays our society isn't as peaceful as it was back in the Sage Kings when they used MCPs, right? Nowadays people are corrupt, and therefore, what is he saying here? MCPs underpunish, right? And as to the concern that the death penalty may overpunish, he says, well, times have changed. Maybe you didn't need to use the death penalty that much in the days of the Sage Kings, and so you can use MCPs and keep the person alive. But nowadays, our society is in a mess, right? And the death penalty still has an important use. Okay, so we're going to skip this, in the interest of time, we'll skip this 5th century figure, and we'll move to the Tang Dynasty. You can see that this subject of MCPs perseveres, right? And just as an aside, I think it's very interesting to study MCPs in the debate because you could think of it as sort of a grand jurisprudential debate that happened in Chinese history through thousands of years, right? And so studying MCPs, I also think, helps us to better understand the traditional Chinese legal system because we can follow and trace the debate through time. Okay, so if we get to the Tang Dynasty, probably one of the most famous essays on MCPs was written by Bai Zhiyi. I think many people here will know Bai Zhiyi because he's very well known, of course, in Chinese societies as an outstanding poet and an outstanding writer. What many people don't know is, though, he wrote an essay on MCPs and basically set forth a very anti-MCP position. Okay, and I'll show you in translation that essay, and as we go through it, you'll see. I think none of you will be surprised. The arguments he advances are essentially similar again to the anti-MCP people we've looked at. So again, apologies in advance for the text, but I want to show you the full essay to preserve its integrity. This is from a collection of his writings called Forest of Theses. And in case any of you are wondering what's the background of this collection of essays, Bai Zhiyi, he was studying for the civil service examinations at the time because he wanted to be a high-ranking government official, and at that time one way you could become a government official was to take the civil service examinations, right, in the Tang Dynasty. Although I should point out that in the Tang, at least, there were other ways that people used besides the civil service examinations. For example, based on your family lineage, right? If you were from a prominent government family, you could get a position pretty easily, or through recommendation letter. So if a prominent government official now recommended you, you could get in. But he was studying for the exams, and as part of practice, right? I think it's something that law students do today very often, right? You practice answering hypothetical questions, right, or old exams. He's practicing, right? He's practicing writing this essay, this policy essay on what he thinks about MCPs. And if we just take a look at it, right, what does he write? I believe that when discussing issues, we must take reality as our evidence and data. Therefore, when using punishments, one must understand the specific actual situation. If we discuss the matter from the perspective of reality, MCPs can only be abolished and cannot be reinstated. Why is this? What is meant by MCPs are, and he explains what they are, right? Punishments such as cutting off the nose, breaking of bones and tendons, carving the face, and hacking feet. The Book of Documents records 5 brutal punishments. In antiquity, the Miao people started to abusively use them. Because of this, heaven brought down suffering on them to punish them. You guys see he's quoting back to the Book of Documents we looked at on the beginning slide. The Qin Dynasty also violently and brutally used them, and in the end, the people's heart went astray and the Qin fell. If MCPs are used, how could many innocents not be killed? I have also heard that sages' principles for using punishment were, in accordance with the needs of changing times, choose the proper light or heavy punishment, and also in accordance with the particular person's disposition to decide upon whether to punish or not. isn't this a repeat of Kongrong and Zhou Yi's arguments about MCPs are not good because we need to change with the times? It's essentially the same, right? Therefore, it is completely unnecessary to divorce ourselves from the practical situation of today and to go back and reinstate the old, obsolete MCPs. Moreover, MCPs have been abolished for a very long time. People have even forgotten about the long time ago. If they are suddenly reinstated, some will have their tendons and muscles cut off, some will have their bones broken, others will have their faces carved. When people see this, they will definitely feel sadness and bitterness. If they hear about this, their fear will not cease. This is not in accordance with the principles advocated by the sages about changing with the times and handling affairs with a person's disposition. So again, he follows Kongrong and Zhou Yi's arguments about MCPs not being suitable for the time. He also talks about the bad consequences, right? He advances a consequentialist argument against MCPs, talks about how because people have forgotten them, they will have no effect basically now, and it'll cause people to be really scared and they won't be able to live their life in peace. Okay? And he also, I think you could say that he advances an argument that was made by Emperor Wen of the Han Dynasty, Han Wendi, when Han Wendi, Emperor Wen, abolished the MCPs. Remember, Emperor Wen was saying, oh, they're so cruel, they're so terrible, right? Bai Zhiyi clearly believes that as well. We finally get to the 12th century AD in the Song Dynasty, where there was a famous debate of MCPs recorded between Zhu Xi and Chen Liang, two Song Dynasty officials. Now you'll notice in this journey, we've gone from 167 BC all the way to the 12th century. So what is that, about 1,000 years? And you can see so far, the ideas expressed in the debates have not really changed that much. And you'll see they don't really change much in this debate either. So Zhu Xi, okay. Zhu Xi, for those of you that may not know, a very, very important Confucian thinker in Chinese history. And he's perhaps most well known for compiling Confucian texts into the 4 books, the Si Shu, okay, and writing commentaries on them. He's very influential because basically his commentaries and his understanding of these Confucian texts form the basis of the Chinese civil service examinations from about 1313 to 1905. 1905 is when the civil service examinations were basically ended. So this guy, for what, 600 years, his ideas about Confucianism formed the basis of the state curriculum, right? And this is always very interesting because most people think, Zhu Xi is a Confucian. He's been described as the second most important Confucian, actually, after Confucius by some scholars. Most of the time we think of Confucius and Confucianism in terms of law and punishment. We think of Confucians as always advocating lesser punishment, leniency, right? And Zhu Xi is very interesting because he advances a staunchly pro-MCP view, okay? And what does he say? Today, the punitive laws of penal servitude and exile are unfortunately no longer sufficient in order to stop and prevent the treachery of the crimes of theft and debauchery. Furthermore, some of the punishments levied today are far too excessive. Those that should not have been executed are being executed, such as individuals that have committed crimes in the category of rape. If we adopt the proposals of Chen Qun, that is, to punish them under the criminal law by castration or whipping, although this would cause harm to their limbs, these punishments would nevertheless preserve their lives and destroy the root of their desires to commit evil, as well as physically preventing them from having the means to engage in the crimes again. Would this not preserve the intentions of the ancient sage kings, as well as appropriately dealing with the problems of our age? He's essentially basically restating Liu Song's arguments in favor of MCPs, right? He's concerned about underpunishing now. He's also concerned that current punishments do not provide adequate deterrence or incapacitation effects, right? So, a very similar argument to those that have been advanced previously. Now, he is countered by an official Chen Liang, who expresses anti-MCP views. Let's take a look at what Chen Liang writes, okay, in his position on MCPs. Emperor Han came to his senses after hearing the words of a girl, and with emotion abolished mutilating corporal punishments And thus with him, we can clearly understand the principle of conforming and accommodating the needs of the current situation and times. By the way, I apologize, I didn't explain the full story. In case anybody is wondering, Emperor Han came to his senses after hearing the words of a girl. What does that refer to? Essentially, I believe the story was, before Emperor Wen, MCPs were being used, and when he came to the throne, they were still being used. And one day, I think it was a government official. I don't think it was a major government official, but he had committed a crime and he was sentenced to an MCP. And what the historical record tells us is that this man's daughter came to court begging Emperor Wen to spare her father from the humiliation of the MCP. And she basically said that she would be willing to give herself up for slavery, right? Service to the state, to be a slave, a palace slave essentially, if Emperor Wen would but let her father go. And according to the story, Emperor Wen was so moved and touched by her devotion to her father and dedication to her father, right, that he abolished MCPs completely, okay? And so what's Chen Liang's point? Chen Liang's point is Emperor Wen is somebody who personifies the idea that we should change the laws and punishment in accordance to the times. Therefore, there were MCPs before, but now, based on that situation, the girl begging for a father, he's flexible enough to change, right? From the times of the Yellow Emperor, the well-field system and the enfeoffment system passed through the thorough consideration and analysis of 10 sages. Thus, these systems were maintained and put into practice. There was fear that one thing might not be complete, or one regulation might not be detailed enough in implementing them. As for MCPs, however, the sages set up multiple different avenues for the people to be exempt from such punishment, which shows a fear that they would even be used. Okay? So basically, he's just making a historical argument. He claims that the sages, even though the sages did use MCPs, they had a lot of checks and balances, right? Which shows that they weren't that so excited about MCPs, right? Because remember, the people supporting MCPs keep saying what? The Sage Kings use them, the Sage Kings use them. Why shouldn't we? And Chen Liang continues, the laws of today are sufficient to make the people feel shame. If the people have nothing to depend on to live, then even if we use MCPs every day, they will still flout and disregard the law. If ritual propriety and etiquette are used to shape people's thoughts, if music is used to make people's voices harmonious, if regulations are used to govern, if punishments are used to prevent evil, and if these are all implemented and not in conflict, then the kingly way will succeed. This is what I have heard about MCPs from the Sage Kings. And so again, making an argument essentially that the times have changed, MCPs are no longer necessary. Our society today, the laws are sufficient. People are educated enough that they feel shame based on the current punishment. So why should we bring back MCPs and interfere with that? So I'll just conclude now and summarize everything we've discussed so far. So I hope that you can see that the content of the debate, both the pro-MCP side and the anti-MCP side, generally did not change for 1,000 plus years. The MC debate also shows us that at least in traditional Chinese legal thought, punishment arguably was justified, true, on a variety of grounds, so retribution arguments, consequentialist arguments, right? But primarily thinkers, either on the pro-MCP side or the anti-MCP side, primarily relied on consequentialist arguments. So for example, again, the people who supported MCP said it's good deterrence, it can incapacitate criminals, it can reform criminals, right? Whereas the people who argued against MCP says, no, MCPs just bring disorder to society, right? They don't deter people, they don't reform people, they'll actually cause people to lose hope and commit even more crimes. Continuing influence on views of punishment in modern China. This is not a talk on modern China, but one might think, right, obviously in modern China, mainland China today, there's no MCPs, of course, right? But one could argue that the way in which the Chinese state thinks about the purpose of punishment is still in a very, very similar way, right, as in the traditional Chinese thinkers, right? I think The current state sees punishment, right, again, primarily as having good consequential effects, right, so good deterrence effects, right, reformation effects, and so forth. And just one last point is, if we want to perhaps note one perhaps more unique theory of punishment, justificatory theory of punishment here, that's not just simply retribution or consequentialist arguments, right? You can see that all of the thinkers, or many of the thinkers, stress the importance of antiquity and following the sage kings, right? And both sides took pains to show themselves as truly honoring antiquity, right? So, for example, Liu Song emphasizing that MCPs were established by the sage kings, but on the other side, Bai Zhiyi saying, no, we shouldn't have MCPs again because it was the sage kings that followed the principle of setting policies and according to the needs of the current times. And Chen Gang basically presenting a different historical argument, saying that the pro-MC people are wrong. The sage kings did not like MCPs. In other words, abolition and reinstatement of the MCPs were both justified by appealing to the ancient sage kings' love for the people. Okay. So with that, I will stop, and I look very much forward to questions, answers, comments, and discussion. Thank you very much. Thank you.